Right, we turn to this now. An opinion piece authored by Sasria Executive Manager Muzi Dlala has reflected on the role of protests in democracies. He says social mobilization enables people to communicate to the political elites between elections or to express discontent with the inefficient institutions. He's joining us now for more insights. Good to have you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for having me.
So we just spoke to Idlula Miti, and they are doing scenario planning, which I'm sure is something that you at Sasria would look at and something that you would be conducting yourselves in terms of what the future looks like. And what have the lessons of the past, right, in terms of what we saw, particularly around the July unrest, taught you about what could possibly happen in the future?
Yeah, it taught us a lot. I think one of the biggest lessons is, in as much as we could plan, really, and keep so much reserves, we must always look at what could possibly go wrong outside of that. So one of the things that we didn't really plan for was the breakdown, for instance, in the defense mechanisms, like the police not responding on time, and army being delayed, and all of those type of things. So I mean, we had really, really good plans, but things really fell apart. So we needed to look at not only do you plan properly, but you look at what could go wrong within the means of what you have as mitigation.
Yeah, and when you look at what was driving it ends up being a kind of faceless uprising, so to speak, because it just kind of took over and everybody in the township became a part of it. But what was the commonality? Was as you put it, the relative deprivation theory at work, or was it just a social identity theory at work when you look at what happened?
To understand what happened, we needed to look back first as to what happened. So the two theories you're quoting now are the ones that have been sustaining South African protest for the longest of time. You know, individuals being discontent because they were relatively deprived of certain things, and therefore having to do whatever they can to be included into whatever systems. But July 2021 presented with something totally different, something new. And that's where we look at de-individuation theory. So that's a theory that pretty much looks at individuals when they are immersed into a group, and there's, I would say they are anonymous in that group, and they are also not able to be pinpointed for accountability. So when there's an event that takes place and there's a group of people and those individuals have not really looked at having something that is in particular to a particular unrest that might take place. So what they tend to do is they tend to then do things that are out of character, things that ordinary citizens would not necessarily do. That's when you see destruction of property. I mean, some of the things that happen is people looted, and after looting, they destroyed the property. And that's something that has not really been quite happening in South Africa over the years. We've had many protests, really, that took place. But this one, so we are anchoring it on the de-individuation theory. So it's got three aspects. The first one is the one that I was just mentioning, that when there is anonymous or not a face that is as a result of that. We know that the president, the previous president, actually was the one that was incarcerated. And as a result of that, he did not really group people together to do that. So there were other forces that were present that actually kind of drove the whole thing. So that's the first part. The second one is that in as much as that is the case, why was this different from any others? One is that if you look at some of the events that we had in the past in South Africa, and you look at the ones that we had even after July 2021, one of the things that were quite present was that some of the, I'd say the mechanisms, or how do you explain this? So some of the reasons why this was happening were not really there, and the people could not even understand really why it was happening the way that it was happening. And I think the lack of anonymity, I think, is the big thing that I wanted to touch on in this, to say that if we are to have some events that are going to be like this in the future, we need to make sure that we have certain defenses that are in place to mitigate against this, because there's an article that we did in, I'd say, in July this year. So we were looking at taking day-to-day account of why, or of which days of the 9 days did actually have the most damage. So day number 3, day number 4, and day number 5. So those are the ones. So it shows that the delay as a result of the police not responding maybe on time, maybe made it for the people to see that they could go ahead and do this. But in as much as that is the case, looting was one thing, but destroying of property and touching it in strategic places to destroy, there were other elements obviously at play as well, which we needed to look at.
Now with the executive manager at Sasria, Muzi Dlala, he put together a piece around dissent and the country being at a crossroads in how we are handling or even predicting what would happen in these scenarios. So if we are, for example, looking at where we are now, political activism versus just activist movement, civil society, are there defining traits that we could look at that would give us with absolute clarity a sense of, okay, there's something that is cooking here that would catapult and blow up in our faces? I'm asking that in the context of the conversation that I've just had now,
right,
with Indrila Miti saying, well, we'll get to a Weaver state where everybody would be up to here. So civil society, private sector, normal citizens will be up to here, and that would rally them together, and they will take to the streets, and they will force government to actually listen and deliver services.
Absolutely. And I think until such time that we address the fundamental reasons why people take to the streets, I think we're probably going to see more of the in-group and the out-group. So part of what the theories look at is for a dissent to be there and for people not to be able to resolve, it's because there are people who feel aggrieved, there are people who are on the receiving end of that, and the people who are on the other hand, which is the one that are actually perpetrating this. So the in and out groups are the reasons why actually people do what they do. But for people to get to a position where they resort to violence, I think that's now the sense that we need to start looking at what point do people actually start resorting to violence. It is when the minimum reasons why they're doing this, if they're deprived of certain things that they feel fundamentally are their rights, or something that is perceived to be given to others is not given to them. And then obviously those are the things that lead to people getting to a point where they're like totally disgruntled and they would act totally irrationally. And I mean, we've seen it happen when people protest. And again, I understand that, remember in the past, protesting was the way for South Africans to be heard.
Yeah.
And South Africans being heard, it was a crime to protest and to do what was done prior to 1994. And then it subsequently became a constitutional right to protest. But people were never socialized into saying what you used to do in the past to be heard is now actually your right to do it, but you doing it, you have to do it now in a manner that is in line with what the right, the fundamental right says, and then that you cannot encroach on other people's rights at the same time while you are doing that. So I think that socialization is not there, it's missing. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
So all
but you see, one can argue that in that instance, Sharpeville massacre and so on and so forth, the June 16 was based on a principle of some sort, of justice and equality and so on and so forth. And they look at the July unrest, and for many people it didn't make sense, even though the instigators would have said, well, you've arrested an old man and you must set him free. And then everybody would look, man, why steal a fridge?
Yeah.
Why pick up a bed? And why break the windows of the shop and destroy other businesses? Because you're fighting with correctional services or fighting whatever authority there is. And then they're saying, well, what's the principle there? Or is it just a random act of chaos?
Yeah, so we went back, we spoke to even some of the people that actually did this themselves to get to understand, even during the time when the protest was happening. There are two fundamental things that we came to conclusions of. The first one is that the fact that individuals they just joined in. So they saw people doing things and looting and doing all of those things. And obviously there were others who were in it for different reasons, other political reasons, I would say. But the majority of the people that were mobilized are actually normal citizens that are deprived, and they just felt like they could just come in and do the same. And then the other thing, which is quite important as well, is that for every protest, or any event when people are going to take to the street, if it doesn't have a face that people can always go back to and hold accountable, and that particular face to be the one that talks to the people, people tend to listen to that face. So if that face is not there, July 2021, there was no face. No face was there. Yeah. And the individuals that got involved into this thing, they got away with it because they did it, because they knew they can get away with it, because there's no face.
Yeah, the only faces that we saw, the faces that were with the police, Operation Dlala and the likes, were more on the side of the police trying to block those who are coming to burn and to loot. In fact, the likes in particular becoming quite popular. But we also saw political parties themselves, I mean, ANC premiers and so forth, siding more with the police, but not really seeing the face of who's on the other side.
True. And I'll tell you, from looking at the civilians, looking at the damage as it took place, there are two particular community parties that actually helped a lot in resolving this. And that talks to exactly what we're going to be doing next. The one is, as you say, the communities themselves. They organized themselves, and then they said, well, you're not going to destroy property that is within our area, because our mothers and sisters, they work in those areas as well. And we saw the taxi industry as well. I think for their own selfish reasons, but for reasons, obviously, of making sure that there's order, they made sure that they were blocking the protesters that were coming to destroy, because then if it means there's no mall, it means there's no transportation, it means there's no income for them as well. So those two, they played a very, very, very big part in trying to mitigate against the risk, especially when it got to the point where there was complete chaos, like complete lawlessness. There was a point where people went to loot, came back, and then they went back again. They looted the entire store completely. I'll tell you a story of what happened in KZN at the LG factory. They took everything. When they realized that those were shells, they're not TVs, they were empty, they came back and they destroyed, they torched the building, and they burned it totally to the ground.
Sure. And where are we now? I mean, if we look at that scenario and the hardship that many people are going through, and largely because of the geopolitical situation, and rising fuel, rising cost of living, inflation, and so on and so forth, versus, of course, also looking at the political situation, the lack of service delivery.
Yeah, you're touching on the major issues. If we look at our claims, majority of claims come from big protests like we saw, but service delivery is a big issue as well. So from our side, I think as an entity that takes the risk, it is important for us to get involved in, there are three things we're doing. The first one is we raise awareness. I'm sure you would have seen the documentary that we've done, the Sasria documentary, to raise awareness, to show all we're saying there is that the biggest loser at the end of the day is actually the individual that is the one potentially would have been part of the protest, or just your normal community members. The second one is mobilizing the two parties that we saw that could respond quite well. So we're starting Guamashu, like right now, for instance. We are building community centers. So we are in talks right now with the municipalities, with some of the community leadership. Build community centers, find things to do for the youth that is unemployed, that sits there, so that they can be part of the call. When we call and say, there's a problem here, we need you to protect your property. And then obviously the taxi industry. We're partnering with the insurance companies of South Africa, all of them, to look at building things like, pollution facilities, taxi ranks, so that we could also utilize that structure as well in mitigating against the risk. Because the looting part of it is one thing, but the destroying of property, it doesn't speak we are hungry at all. It actually speaks another language that is a language that we should not be embracing in South Africa at all. Yeah.
Does it resonate? I mean, when you go back now to those communities where you say there used to be a particular retail store here that would have hired your sister, your uncle, and your cousin, some of those are not reopening. In fact, they just went, that's it, it's done. And now that particular job opportunity is gone. So when you go back to them, does that resonate? Does it make sense?
It does to a large degree, but the unfortunate part is that it resonates with the people who are at home, the moms, the grandmothers who look after the kids, a lot more than it does, I would say, with the youth. So I think the youth requires different types of attention, because going back to them and you know, raising awareness doesn't really talk to them directly, other than doing things that will engage the youth and bring them something that they would have to lose. Because majority of them, especially the few that we managed to interview, is people that really honestly have nothing to lose. And if you have nothing to lose, then obviously it is easier to be mobilized into things like this at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's an education issue, but also what you mentioned earlier, it was a readiness issue, whether or not that became a wake-up call for the security cluster in terms of readiness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we cover this in the documentary as well, looking at what happened, you know, where the breakdown was. We have subsequently been talking, obviously, to the clusters, to government in particular. I'm sure you saw what happened in March. The March event that took place, the police were visible. Even the army was actually just to show that there is response now relative to what it wasn't before. Because, I mean, the international community, particularly where we source capacity for reinsurance and all that, they just said that, but you guys were not able to respond. So events like that one, in as much as counterintuitively people were like, no, we don't need that. But it's just good for us that we can demonstrate that exercising your right to demonstrate as envisaged in Section 17 of the Constitutional Act is a good thing to do, but it has to be done in a way that does not destroy property, does not encroach on others' rights as well. So the response from the police, I can tell you they're working on it in terms of capacity and in terms of making sure that managing crowds, police need to be taught to know exactly how to manage crowds. So they're working on it, at least from the talks that we are having.
Muzi, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming in and being a part of our conversation tonight. That's Muzi Dlala, Executive Manager at Sasria there.